Hello, everyone. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fire podcast. This is episode 109 of the Roundtable, the triumph of the military-industrial complex. Alec was not able to join us today, but we still have with us, per usual, Keith Preston and Florian. So what sort of got me started on this train of thought was a few things. Earlier this year, I read H.C. Engelbrecht's The Emergence of Death, which was published in the 1930s, but basically is giving us the backstory of where the military-industrial complex eventually comes from. And a video by the Caspian Report where it talks about how Europe is remilitarizing and trying to build its own military-industrial complex, which of course is highly ironic given its dovish policy in the war on terror with countries like France and Germany opposing U.S. invasion of Iraq. And so I thought, well, there was a time, both in Europe and the United States, when there were large, quote-unquote, liberal, progressive, anti-war elements in these countries. And they seem to be completely, totally gone. There's really no countervailing voice to the sort of hard diplomacy of the neocons to just go in there and, blow the door off the hinges, rather than, the sort of like Barack Obama, soft power, indirect Arab Spring kind of thing, even though he did take direct action as well, like in Libya. So I think this is an interesting topic to consider. So we can broadly divide the parts into the rise of war profiteering in the modern world, okay, and then the creation of the military-industrial complex itself, and then the breaking down of resistance, primarily in the United States, to this. And this is where Engelbrecht's book comes in to be very insightful, The Emergence of Death. He pinpoints this. There's always been people that sell weapons and or mercenaries and sell their services for war. So this isn't a new thing. But the idea of an organized, capitalistic enterprise of making weapons, with them, according to Engelbrecht, begins in Liege in the 15th century, and then later, it becomes a national enterprise, like in France and Germany, the United States, Great Britain, and other places. And so what happens is there's a demand for armaments and weapons for states waging these wars of unification. And part of that is, okay, well, they need the production of large-scale amounts of armaments more than just, what small artisans could produce. And so that becomes the first market for these emergence of death. And then, of course, once they get large enough, there becomes a global market. And then they have this sort of, in the early stages, they wouldn't sell weapons to countries that they thought might fight their country as a matter of nationalist principle. But eventually the profit motive wore that away, and they don't really mind selling to other nations that may or may not use those weapons against their main country. And now, so in the United States in World War I and in the interwar period when this book was published, had the most of any other country. I mean, as far as just like firearms producers, it was just gobs and gobs and gobs of independent firearms producers. Compared to whereas in Europe, it was maybe like one or two per country. For Germany, they had Mauser, right? That was their key armaments producer. France had Schneider. So that's a brief survey of how this all develops up until 1945. And then you have the U.S. armaments for World War II. And then that creates a large enterprise for the production of weapons, which had existed after the Civil War and after World War I, but was subsequently dismantled for peace purposes, because the American people viewed those at the time as emergencies, and they didn't want to live in a constant state of emergency. But of course, that eats into the profits of the arms dealers. So they eventually conglomerate into the military-industrial complex. And Eisenhower, who at the time of World War II praised it at the end of his presidential term, condemns it as a potential danger to the democracy and the republic. And his warning is, of course, correct. Many of the things he warned about have happened. One of the ways it stayed in power was creating the Soviet threat. And, if you're familiar with my channel, then of course, what we're doing, what I've done with Sutton and others, is that I think a lot of the Soviet threat was propped up and intentionally created to justify military expenditures on the one hand. Second of all, they distributed their production throughout all 50 states so that it made it very difficult for any senator to want to cut military spending, because that would mean jobs lost in his district. And this is the real key part here. How did they defeat their opposition in the anti-war movement? So in the 60s, the anti-war movement was reaching a crescendo along with the labor movement. And this is where my theory about the culture war being a frozen conflict controlled by counter gangs comes in. As Phil Oakes said, you want to have a singular culture if you want to resist the war machine, not all these countercultures. And so by creating all these countercultures and false consciousnesses, if you will, people lost sight of what really mattered politically, what really mattered internationally, and they started fighting over these totemic issues, which don't really actually matter. So all the direct threat, all the direct heat that was going to the military-industrial complex is gone. And so if you read articles from like the 20s and the 30s, or even before that, like in the late 19th century, in the U.S. press, I mean, they were often fingered as just these like quasi-criminal enterprises that made money off the suffering of mankind. And both Republicans and Democrats would condemn them for this. And now it's completely the opposite. You've got this complete acceptance of these industries as vital to national security. So part of it is the culture war. The other part of it is, I forget what it was, but there was a CIA initiative to put government and military agents in the press in order to get them to report favorably. That began in, I think, the 60s. So that's another effort that has also successfully weakened any sort of anti-war movement. And then to wrap it all up in a bow, we've got Caleb Maupin's concept of the synthetic left, where you have this fake left that is actually pro-war, pro-intervention, and doesn't actually stand for the traditional principles of, you know, the Western left historically. And so this is a brief summary of the rise of arms profiteering in the first place, the military-industrial complex in America, and then how it eventually gained total hegemony, even to the point where now Europe is going to build its own military-industrial complex. Keith.
There are a lot of different factors at play here. As far as what we see going on in Europe now, I think that what has happened is that we're moving into a world order that is multipolar for the first time since really since around the beginning of the 20th century, certainly prior to World War II. You know, after World War II, we had a bipolar world during the Cold War. You know, the two rival power blocks, and then in the post-Cold War period, we had a unipolar world where the United States achieved for a time this kind of global hegemony. But in the last, I guess, 7 or 8 years, we've started to see a move back to a multipolar world. And in many ways, the world order is comparable, or is the world order that's emerging is comparable to about 1900, where the United States now plays the role of the old British Empire, which in 1900, the British Empire was the largest player on the field, but not the only player on the field. And then, ironically, Europe now is very much like what the United States was in 1900. That was a continental economic power, but not a world military power. And the EU collectively is becoming the new United States. And then Russia has reasserted itself in a way that where Russia is basically what it was in the early 19th century. It's a regional power that's somewhat aggressive against its surrounding neighbors, but doesn't really have a global reach that some of these other powers have had. And perhaps in some ways, China is analogous to Japan in its developmental stages, where it was largely an isolated power in the Pacific or in the East Asia, but hadn't really become an empire yet. And then we see all these other rising powers as well. We see Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, India, Indonesia. There's a number of others. So we're moving more towards a world order kind of like 1900. And then that explains why Europe is now becoming more militaristic. I think that the situation with Russia and Ukraine and all of that has spurred that quite a bit. Also, I think the Europeans are increasingly looking at the Americans as unstable or unreliable allies. The right wing of American politics has become increasingly Europhobic as well. After I know, going back to the time of the Iraq War, a lot of the conservative side of U.S. politics often would just portray Europeans as weak or soft or or whatever. And I think that that's starting to work both ways. I think the Europeans increasingly view the Americans as having lost their minds in certain ways. And American society is becoming dysfunctional, and they look at it like, do we really want to be depending on these people for defense in the future? So they're trying to move in their own direction. But in a historical context, the military-industrial complex in the United States emerged out of the massive buildups that we saw during World War I and World War II and the Cold War. And there were plenty of people, as Todd said, on the left and right that warned that this would be a problem. On the left, you had people like classical progressives like Charles Beard and people like that. And then on the right, you had the people, like there was a book published in the 70s called Prophets on the Right by Ron Radosh. Ron Radosh was actually a Marxist at the time, but he was profiling these figures from the American right in the early to mid 20th century that warned about the military-industrial complex and globalism and that kind of thing. People like Lawrence Dennis and all of that. And then even President Eisenhower said that the military-industrial complex had become too large and problematic. But after that, it just came to be taken for granted that the military-industrial complex is just a feature of modern society. And if you look at the breakdown in American politics, between the parties and that kind of stuff, I've spoken before about Carl Oglesby's thesis that the Democrats, in their present incarnation at least, represent the Northeastern establishment, whereas the Republicans represent the Sun Belt. I think if you break it down to material interest, I would be inclined to say that the Northeastern establishment, the Democrats tend to be most representative of the international bankers. If there's any one faction that is most influential in that sector, would be international bankers, or perhaps the elites within the energy industries and that kind of thing. What Caleb Maupin calls the oil bankers. All of these Rockefeller, Rothschild derived interests. And then on the Republican side, if there's one thing that could be considered the owners of the Republican Party, it would be the merchants of death. It would be the military-industrial complex, the arms manufacturers, and all of that kind of stuff. Many of whom have manufacturing operations in the Sun Belt, and have since the Cold War period. So you have the back and forth between the parties at that level is between the military-industrial complex and the international bankers over whose interests are going to take priority. And of course, a lot of people have their hands in both as well. So the power of the military-industrial complex was also accompanied by the rise of this thing that today is now called the deep state, which is really just the intelligence services and the military bureaucracy. If we go back and we look at the beginnings of what becomes the culture war, like this whole red versus blue culture war thing that dominates U.S. politics today, some of that is traceable to the 1950s and 1960s, because in the 1950s you saw the rise of so-called movement conservatism, what becomes to be called movement conservatism, which is William F. Buckley, and then politicians like Barry Goldwater and then Ronald Reagan and all of that kind of stuff. But the CIA, the intelligence services, always had their hands deep in the new right, in the post-war conservative movement. I mean, Buckley himself was a former employee of the CIA, as were a lot of his compatriots in the founding of conservatism. You had, conservatism was founded by former CIA employees, actual members of the intelligence services, and all of that, along with these kinds of right-wing reactionaries that were that admired figures like Francisco Franco, which you previously didn't see in U.S. politics, as well as ex-communists that wanted to have a showdown with their former comrades. And that's really where conservatism, as it's thought of today, comes from. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the same was true in the sense that when the new left started to emerge in the 50s and 60s, the intelligence services always had their hands deep in that. You had the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which, and Caleb Maupin has written about this extensively, where the Congress of Cultural Freedom was a CIA front project that was trying to create a form of leftism that was going to be a controlled opposition to sort of undermine the pro-Soviet left. So this was a Cold War project. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was designed to appeal to countercultural types and bohemian types and left-wing intellectuals, liberal intellectuals, artists, all of the kinds of people that you find on the left typically. And in order to steer those kinds of people away from pro-Soviet organizations or sympathy and all that kind of stuff. I mean, Irving Kristol, who later founded the neocons, he was one of the directors of the Congress for Cultural Freedom at one point. So you see the CIA and the intelligence services creating a right-wing controlled opposition for whom, blindly fanatical anti-Sovietism was the main driving force. And then you see that the same intelligence services creating a fake left whose purpose is to basically build a controlled opposition left that's anti-Soviet, which worked fairly well in a strategic sense. So they achieved what they wanted to do. But out of that, we've seen the emergence of a right and a left that largely takes the existence of the military-industrial complex for granted, and they even merge. I mean, that's kind of how we got the modern neocons. We got if you look at the array of interests that control the American foreign policy establishment today, whether it's the Kristol types, whether it's the Newland types, whether it's the New America Foundation and the Samantha Power types, all of these people can trace their ancestry to either post-war conservatism or the post-war new left, and the way in which these actually blended together eventually to this neocon, neoliberal paradigm. And that's why you don't have any kind of anti-war left or right today to speak of. I mean, if you look at the U.S. Congress, for example, how many anti-war politicians do you actually have? Very few. I mean, liberal or conservative, Democratic or Republican. We saw that in the recent votes taken in Congress over aid to Taiwan, aid to Ukraine, aid to Israel. I mean, the votes in favor of aid to Taiwan was the greatest, which I think indicates that the ruling class considers China to be their main geopolitical adversary. The vote in favor of aid to Israel was almost as wide, and there are other reasons for that. Obviously, the power of the Israel lobby, as Mearsheimer and Walt have written about. Interestingly, there seems to be a sharp division within the ruling class over Russia. The one faction of the ruling class is very anti-Russian. Basically, has the same view of Russia they had during the Cold War, and the other faction seems to have become, more, if not, I wouldn't say sympathetic to Russia, more Russia indifferent. They'd rather focus on China or the Middle East. But nowhere in there do we see politicians that are, comparable to some of these old school politicians that were skeptical of military interventionism. Like we see very few actual Taft Republican types today. We see very few liberals in the tradition of, say, Jeanette Rankin or somebody like that, or George McGovern. I mean, how many George McGovern Democrats do we have today? I can't think of any. Even some of these people that are labeled the Squad, even they are to the right of the old anti-Vietnam War Democrats. So, yeah, that's where we are. And Todd did a pretty good job outlining the narrative as to how this happened.
Thank you, Keith. Now, before we go on to you, Florian, we did get a comment from Jerry Watt saying that it was Project Mockingbird, and I wanted to let him know that I saw that. That's where the CIA put in government agents into the media in order to have a positive spin. So thanks for that, Jerry Watt. Florian, your thoughts?
Yeah, I saw the comment Mockingbird, and reminded me of the Hunger Games Mockingjay, and I was always like wondering a little bit whether that had anything to do with that, or whether they chose that word for like by coincidence. But anyway, I got interested in the military-industrial complex when I first heard about it. Was towards I knew the Eisenhower comments, but where it really became apparent to me was in 2014, 2015, where he basically outlined that you can basically see like a triangle, right? You have a military-industrial complex and all the associated institutions in the US. They wage war overseas, which creates human suffering and misery, which leads to people having to immigrate towards the northern, like to Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And this massive immigration wave creates favorable conditions for employers because, there's more competition for work. You know, you can't tell me that there's a Syrian guy. Yeah, there's some Syrian youth that are not behaving in a civilized manner, but you know, the 40-year-old Syrian guy who has a bakery, he doesn't want to go to Germany and reopen his bakery there, but it's bombed, so he needs to go somewhere else, right? um and yeah, and that then fits in, like, you have more competition for workplace for work positions, and that feeds the entire system, going back to the military industrial complex and its associated institutions in the US, right? I think the origins of the military industrial complex were in the 30-year war, where you had the first occurrences of mercenaries. So for the first time, you had people that would actually go and wreck villages and get paid for that. And after what Todd said, it's I forgot the name, but Lenge or Denge or something like
Liege. Liege.
Liege.
It's a Belgian city. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. So you said 15th century. So the origins may have been even earlier. And but these mercenaries, they were the actual cruel factions in the 30-year war. Those would go and burn down villages, and part of that is probably because if you just get paid for, yeah, but for waging war, you don't have any loyalty to the country. You don't have any loyalty to the people. You don't see the people as normal people that could also live in your own country. Maybe you lay waste to a village that is in the duchy just opposite to yours, very close, but you don't care because you get paid for that. And in the larger perspective, uh, you don't get loyalty from people that are being paid to defend your country, right? They just see it as a job. And the more people you have in these military industrial complex that get paid, the less the people that are actually in the country, those also don't stay loyal, because if everything is corporatized, then I mean, why do you want to fight for the military industrial complex to bomb some? Why do you want to go in the Middle East, right? Is there another war coming that the powers that be might want to drag us in? Nobody wants to sacrifice their sons and daughters to go like around the world and wage war anymore. That's very unpopular, and so we have created a system that makes everyone disloyal. And indeed, like the military industrial complex, it's not like people go there because they want to fight and they want to defend their country. No, they go to these institutions because it's a normal job, right? They sit in some office and they basically shift files from one side of the room to another, now with computers, but basically that's what they do. And and um and you know, that leads to a big problem. We have these um, blown out of proportions institutions and companies, and they don't really the countries aren't really benefiting from them. Plus there's probably a lot of waste going on. You know, if especially conservatives put the finger on, there's a lot of waste going on with social services. No doubt there is, but I don't want to know how much we overpay certain military hardware that we get for our country, right? Because there's just no real oversight. You don't want to be too critical towards the military, right? Because you want to destroy your country. No, no, no. We need the military, and then everything is like green lighted without any bigger oversight. And I think that leads to a lot of inefficiency. And so the military industrial complex is not only a corporate machinery where war becomes something you pay for, and it's all like, and sees people just as cannon fodder, literally. No, it's also very inefficient, and it's a detriment to the national economy. Um, Keith said something about the multipolar world order, and that Europe also now tries to create its own military industrial complex. I'm a little bit less um, beneficial. I tend like less of a benefit of the doubt to the Europeans. They wanted to compete with the US. They wanted to do that from the get go. I remember friends of mine were working for the European Union, and he told me that they basically were creating an alternative GPS system. right? So we never heard of that again, but there was a European version of the GPS to have an alternative to the American version. So there was already during the 2000s an element of competition. So that could also be, of course, Europeans could also say, look, the Americans aren't reliable allies anymore, but there was an element of competition also from the get-go. And yeah, that's what came to my mind spontaneously right now.
So I want to bring this up too. When you brought up the idea about causing conflict to create immigration waves, Hasham Awan said Florian has an excellent point, and I agree. That was a really good insight you had there. But back to the military-industrial complex as a whole, I think this is where the culture war has been extremely detrimental. Rather than arguing about real substantive political and economic issues, like wars that the United States starts, and the incentives of certain corporations to cause wars because that's how they make money. You know, you can think of Spenley Butler's war as a racket. Where we're talking about completely asinine stuff that just is not would never have risen to the level of political commentary at any other point in American history. And what it does is it sort of saturates the mind space with just the noise, right? The culture war creates all this noise so that you can't actually focus on, you know, the thing that matters. And I think one of the other reasons why the opposition failed against the military-industrial complex is yesterday Keith and I did a video on the First World War, 2 days ago. And on the First World War, I ended by saying that it was the beginning of a new religious movement, the worship of technology with the machine serving the role that God used to play, say, in the Middle Ages. And, you know, I'm in part inspired by Ernst Jünger, where he says that technology is the metaphysic of the 20th century. And we might also add now the 21st. So there's a sense in which if you were living in, say, the Middle Ages or you're reading a Shakespeare play, the characters have an already formulated worldview that they don't bother thinking about anymore. They just act, right? They've already had their worldview formed in their head, and now they're just acting in the world based off of these assumptions. Now, if you're reading Shakespeare for the first time, you may not know what those assumptions are, but you can work your way backwards if you look at how the characters behave, or if you want to read some commentary on Shakespeare, they'll tell you. Instead of, like, say, the church or culture doing that for you, it's the machine. And so part of the problem is people have a sense of consciousness and a view of the world such that the idea is that there's a certain set of things that they believe exist and must be the case for them to make sense of the world. And those are the kinds of things that the military-industrial complex is created to ostensibly, quote, protect. So if you're operating in a space that is protected by the military-industrial complex, and you're trying to fight the military-industrial complex, you'll never win, because the very ground you're standing on only exists because the military-industrial complex carved out space for it. And if it goes away, the space you're standing on goes away too. So you'd have to have a consciousness-raising experience, to use, like, you know, Eastern terminology, to actually beat the military-industrial complex. And so far that hasn't happened. And I think that so far, that's why it keeps winning. Because none of its opposition, I don't want to say they're not principled. That's not the argument. It's that they haven't fully thought out the implications of what they themselves believe and how what they themselves believe and the things that they, for example, many Americans like the standard of living we have. Well, if the military-industrial complex went away and the U.S. Navies went home, we'd have a massive reduction in our standard of living. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants all the U.S. fleets to come home and, an autarkic America. So, of course, you're not going to actually deal the death blow to the military-industrial complex, because subconsciously, I think what Freud called that the id. I think at, like, the level of the id, they know that if they kill this thing, their standard of living is going to go away, and they won't do it. There's, like, some sort of, like, implicit, we're just not going to open that door mentality. And what would have to happen to defeat the military-industrial complex before defeat, I mean, I guess it could self-own. That's quite likely with World War III shaping up. But you'd have to have a complete change of mind where you have a totally different lifestyle and way of life in mind that could be sustained without the military-industrial complex. And we're just not there yet. Keith.
Well, one of the successes of the military industrial complex in deflecting opposition to itself has been the way in which war has increasingly been removed from the average person's experience. For instance, if you look at the various wars in just in American history, you see that most wars significantly impacted the general public up through and including the war in Vietnam. Obviously, the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of Americans died. That would be like millions today. The World War One, and World War Two, the same. In the Korean and Vietnamese War, there were tens of thousands of U.S. deaths, and one thing that I think that the state did after the resistance to the Vietnam War became so popular was they realized that to continue to wage war in a way that was beneficial to the military industrial complex, they had to remove the waging of war from the average person's experience. What was it that made the war in Vietnam so unpopular? Well, it was because it was a draft war. And young American men were faced with the possibility of getting drafted and getting killed in a war that they didn't really see themselves as having much of a stake in. And once the draft was abolished, the anti-Vietnam War movement largely dried up as well. And if you look at the 50 years or so since then, there haven't been any more draft wars. And there hasn't really been much of an anti-war movement either. If you look at all of the subsequent wars, all of these subsequent wars have been largely done through, obviously, professional military, volunteer professional military, where being in the military is a job, or with foreign troops, or with proxy armies, or with mercenaries. And that's how we get groups like Blackwater or Academy or whatever they're called now. The warfare has been waged largely with these kinds of forces since then. And the average person just has far less incentive to oppose warfare when they don't feel directly impacted by it. During past wars, they would do things like not only have the draft, but they would ration fuel. They would ration certain foods like meat or sugar. They would impose special war taxes and that kind of stuff. That's another thing. We don't pay for war with taxes anymore. We just add on to the national debt to pay for it. So the average person's pocketbook isn't directly impacted by war in a visible way, and the average person doesn't really have to worry that much about their physical security when it comes to warfare, unless you're actually in the military or have immediate family in the military or something like that. And if you look at opinion polls, when Americans discuss what their favorite political issues are or what they think is most important, foreign policy and war and everything related to that are usually way down near the bottom of the list. It's usually in the same category as, well, we need more bicycle paths or something like that, because most people just don't feel impacted by it. The United States is really like a huge island surrounded by huge oceans and weak nations to the north and south. So we don't have war going on here, at least not yet. But so the average person doesn't feel physically threatened. The average person doesn't feel economically threatened. And that's been a very shrewd way for the military-industrial complex to be able to do what it does, because it's still just as profitable as it ever was, with practically zero popular opposition.
All right, Florian.
Yeah, it's a great point that Keith brings up. Like, yeah, people haven't had any even indirect sufferings from war, which was different in the First World War and I think Second World War as well. And of course, in Vietnam War, you have the actual bodies coming back, which was much reduced in the Iraq War. But that also led to the Iraq War being very unpopular in the end, right? Because there was not a clear benefit for the U.S. For people, and but they saw a lot of their loved ones being killed over there. I think also Todd points out very, very good point about the military-industrial complex. That if we try to abolish it, it now forms the ground on which we stand, right? So we don't want to fall down in our life, in our life. How do you call it, in our standard of life, standard of living. I wanted to add something that is also that how the MIC works against itself in a way. Since this is a capitalist endeavor or like a corporate endeavor, they also outsource a lot of important things. Like, for example, China still has the majority of rare earth mineral refining capacities, right? Okay, we don't have rare earth so many in the United States, but we could have the refining capacities. But this is all rare earth in Taiwan, and Taiwan and China have the refinery capacities. We don't. So that's one thing that is, even without the MIC, would be detrimental to our national security. We didn't realize, but we were almost at the point where we painfully realized during 2020, 2021, that the majority of our antibiotic industrial capacities are also not in our country, right? That is also kind of dangerous, and but it goes further on. Like, our shipyards are still in the U.S., the majority of them, but still that industry is still outsourcing what they can. I don't know if it really makes so much sense to have parts of our ships being built in Germany and Turkey, right? So I don't want the military-industrial complex to have more influence, but I also point out that it would be good to have some industries that are important to defend our country in our own country, right? And that's also what the MIC works against, paradoxically, maybe. And to close, there was this lady, Ulrich Herrmann, in Germany. She's still making the round on the talk shows, and she has a vision that capitalism will have to end at some point because society cannot grow indefinitely. And then she propagates some idea of subsistence economy. I don't think that's very realistic, but maybe if we replace her criticism in capitalism, and maybe instead of saying this capitalism needs to be replaced, maybe we need to find a way to replace the military-industrial complex. That would be more doable than replacing capitalism.
Okay, so I think the last part I want to touch on is how the military-industrial complex might be digging its own grave. And that's a nice segue because you sort of moved into that, Florian. So the thing that I'm looking at right now is, for all intensive purposes, it looks like the military-industrial complex presently is a sort of galloping gurney leading us to a third world war with conflicts with Russia and Europe, China and East Asia, and then some Middle East crisis, likely provoked by some Israeli action against Gaza or Lebanon. Though, I mean, at this point, who knows? I mean, maybe some black swan event that starts a Middle East crisis that we don't expect. As you said, Florian, it has outsourced a lot of material, in which case see, this is what's really interesting. According to geopolitical theory, Halford Mackinder envisioned this concept called the heartland, where you had a region of Eurasia, which broadly you could say goes from the Dnieper River in Ukraine to somewhere like Mongolia, and goes from like Siberia to Afghanistan. And this whole region is inaccessible to sea power, which is why Mackinder, being British, was concerned that if that ever became politically united in a single state or in a federation or an alliance structure, would really be a problem for the Atlantic powers because they couldn't directly interdict production or supply. Well, we have that now with Russia and China. And it looks like Iran and North Korea and maybe other states are getting involved as well. So they can make decisions based on military necessity. The military-industrial complex of the United States has to make decisions based on economic necessity, supply chains. They have to make sure those supply chains keep running, and that may not be the best strategic move to make, but they have to make it because the very condition for their military power goes away if they don't protect those supply chains. And so what ends up happening now is the Eurasian alliance, that looks like is forming, can afford to make strategic military decisions. The United States cannot. It has to make primarily economic decisions, which, given that now China is the world's leading manufacturer, like the US was in World War II, does not seem to bode well for this Atlanticist power structure. So the sort of economic necessity, I think, will begin to drag it down. The other thing is we've had the recruitment crisis, right? And all four branches of the armed forces in the United States, the Army, the Marines, the Navy, Coast Guard, and the Air Force, they're not meeting their quotas. And that's in part due to the demographic collapse we've witnessed since 1945, where the baby boom was the last really large explosion of human population in the West. And then second of all, the most men and women that would be eligible for the service are not physically fit, right? They might be in the right age range, but they're not healthy enough. And that's due to, in large part, simulation America, right? Everything is junk food, junk bonds, junk everything, but there's no real thing, right? And of course, that's not to say that Russia and China don't have simulations running, but they're more rooted in the real, right? China under Xi Jinping is using Sun Tzu to plan military strategy. The Bush administration was creating its own reality through computer programs. One is not like the other. So I think they're going to have a harder time. Because how do they incentivize people to fight, right? We've talked about mercenaries. We've talked about, the sort of wage incentive. That's becoming increasingly less effective. Right, that we can't. You could sort of appeal to patriotism, but patriotism to what? America's just it's an open market. Everything's for sale. That's not a nation. Russia and China have nations that you can at least appeal to some sort of national solidarity to get people to fight. You just have to, pay people enough money, bribe them enough money to get them to fight, and that may not even be enough anymore. So, the military-industrial complex has a whole lot of incentives that are not really. See, the United States, beginning in the American Civil War, believed that you could just saturate the battle space with material. So you have enough food so your troops can always fight. You have enough ammo, and then you get to machines with tanks and airplanes, and you just flood the battle space. But that doesn't work anymore. Korea, Vietnam, and the war on terror showed us that we lack any coherent strategy to win. The U.S. just thinks we just saturate the battle space with stuff and we're going to win magically. But we don't. And so the Russia and China don't think like that. They think in terms, Clausewitzian terms of, having a coherent political goal to strive for. And the military-industrial complex just doesn't. And so I think for a lot of these reasons, the military-industrial complex is lurching towards a massive cell phone. Keith.
Well, getting back to what I was saying earlier about the difference between, say, the military-industrial complex as it's been since Vietnam, as opposed to prior to that. If we look at the history of American warfare going back to the Revolutionary period, we see that from the late 18th century up till the Vietnam War, the United States rarely, if ever, lost a war. I mean, virtually every war was, a net victory for the United States. If we're starting with the Vietnam War, virtually every war has been a net loss for the United States, unless you want to count things like Grenada or the invasion of Panama in 1989 or something like that, which are really just skirmishes. Any war of any significance has been a net loss. And so at the same time that the military-industrial complex has become so pervasive, it's also become a lot more inefficient. But the question that arises is whether that's by accident or by design. One could argue that warfare today is really just a profit-making enterprise. Not that it wasn't before, but that the geopolitical aspects of the military-industrial complex are really secondary to the profit motive. Because war is profitable to the military-industrial complex, regardless of who wins, and that's one of the things that Anthony Sutton's work provided a lot of insights into. That for the merchants of death, so to speak, it doesn't matter who wins as long as they can make money selling weapons to whoever is involved. And in some ways, it seems like our whole so-called national defense apparatus has succumbed to that, where it's where geopolitical interests, while not absent, are secondary to the profit-making motive. And as far as what the future of that is going to be. Some years ago in the 90s, like I guess at the peak of um, the globalization era, Martin van Creveld, who was a Dutch Israeli military historian, argued that internationally the state was starting to break down as an institution, meaning that fewer and fewer people have the state of their particular nation as their primary loyalty, and that more and more people around the world are transferring their loyalty to other things like everything from tribes and ethnic groups to causes to ideologies to non-state institutions. And similarly, fourth generation warfare theory argues that warfare is being transferred from states to non-state actors. And if you look at warfare as it is today, we've actually seen a significant decrease in the amount of warfare between states. What we have seen for decades now is an increased number of civil wars and warfare waged by non-state actors. And what that indicates is that more and more people are transferring their identity to non-state actors or national subgroupings. I mean, we see that in the United States. In the United States, there are probably more people who are more loyal to the red tribe or the blue tribe as opposed to the United States. Like back in past times, you could find a lot of people would say, well, you may be Republican, you may be Democrat, you may be Protestant or Catholic, but whatever we are, we're all Americans. That kind of national patriotism or civic nationalism was fairly common in past times. You find very little of that today. Nowadays, you find more people who are basically Democrats first, or Republicans first, or red tribe first, or blue tribe first, or something else. Because if you look at how they view elections, they view a victory by the other side as an existential threat and by definition illegitimate. And we're starting to see that in a lot of countries and political systems around the world. Now, it's also true that nation state based nationalism has not disappeared. I mean, you do see these populist nationalist currents that are emerged in various Western countries, but they're really more of a subculture or a political subgrouping that have their own identity. They view themselves, for instance, in the United States, you have people who view themselves as the real Americans, meaning these other types of people are not Americans, irrespective of where they were born or whatever, or whether there's a common political citizenship. And you also see the non-state actors are playing a much important role in international relations. The current conflicts in the Middle East are a good example. 3 of the primary players in the current Middle East conflict are Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. All 3 of those groups are non-state actors. None of those is an actual country. They're all non-state actors, and yet they're assuming the same role as countries, actual nation states have during past times. And if that trend continues, we're likely going to see more and more of that. We're going to see more and more conflict within countries between rival subcultural or political cultural factions, and we're going to see non-state actors assuming a greater role. Question is whether military industrial complexes would be able to survive that. For instance, one question that I've discussed with others elsewhere is how durable is the American military industrial complex? Because when people raise the question of is there going to be a civil war at some point in the United States? And increasingly there have been books and movies and YouTube channels and stuff that say, yeah, there's a civil war is coming. Well, I think the crucial issue of whether there's going to be a civil war is whether the military-industrial complex holds. Would in the time of civil unrest, is the bulk of the military, whether the branches of the services, the National Guard, as well as things like the domestic security, like police and federal law enforcement and all of that kind of stuff, is all of that going to remain loyal to the state? Or is all of that going to fracture into various tribal loyalties? Now, if that happens, that's when the military-industrial complex eventually falls. It fragments. Until that happens, I think the military-industrial complex will remain in control. Because I mean, if we see that in elections, you know, regardless of who the president is, there's a certain continuity in U.S. foreign policy. And if we look at votes taken in Congress on foreign policy issues, and if we look at media coverage of foreign policy issues, we see that the military-industrial complex is over and above all of that. Like the one time MSNBC ever said anything about Donald Trump that was favorable was when he bombed Syria. You know, because so that's what that shows is that there's this ruling class consensus on foreign policy that transcends all these other differences. And as long as all of that remains in place, then the military-industrial complex is going to survive. It's only when the military-industrial complex fractures and cannot hold the center anymore that's going to end.
Okay, Florian.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that more and more. You can hear me, right? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So a lot of alliances are not centered on the nation anymore, but are more tribal and non-state actors. I wonder what happens if actually the United States were attacked, right? Because then the same people that are finding themselves, not connected to the U.S. but more to the country, but more connected to their own group, that may change because now all of a sudden their very fundament of their existence gets attacked. And if we also like maybe a little homage to Aleksey, who's not there today, when we think about Strauss-Howe generational theory, then we are going to experience the next generation as a more civic generation, right? The alpha generation, those are the kids born 2012, 2013. They may be more of a larger group, akin to the hippie and baby boomer the hippie movements in the 1960s that are majority were supported by or built by the baby boomers, right? And then you have all these populist movements that are like the MAGA movement, Trump, and then several of the Eastern European states, people galvanizing behind more populist messages. I wonder whether those couldn't be certain like how do you say, certain germination centers where a true overall national defense would re-emerge, and then the military industrial complex would lose all its fluff because all those DEI initiatives and all this like extra corporate stuff that are not really everything that's too much internally in this big corporate space that the MIC is would be abolished because that becomes too expensive to maintain. The money is now needed to externalize the power of the MIC, right? If we want to talk about it in economic terms. That's why I think the military industrial complex will probably fall apart if the United States were attacked right now, the country, then the MIC would be stripped of its blown out proportions. It may afterwards, after such a war, would go back to what it was before. But for the time being, I think if need be, the MIC will just get rid pretty quickly of like the internal ballast that it has accrued.
All right. So I think we're about time to wrap up. So I'm just going to leave us with two thoughts. I think if the end of the military-industrial complex is to come about internally from actions of U.S. citizens, I think that what's going to have to happen is a revolution in consciousness so that they can envision a social and economic space independent of the one provided by the military-industrial complex. Otherwise, they'll never deliver the final blow. And then secondly, combining what you've said, Keith, and what you've said, Florian, it might self-own on the global stage because it's primarily interested in making money, not winning wars. But when your opponents do want to win wars, well, then you'll lose because you're not playing to win and they are. So that's my final thoughts. Final thoughts, Keith.
Yeah, I think that the Eastern Alliance that's emerged in recent times, the Russia-China Axis of Resistance, DPRK alliance, is something of the wild card in this because on one hand, we see that the Western states seem to be internally fragmenting along cultural lines. And then we see worldwide in the global south, we see the rise of these non-state actors that are increasingly just as important as states. The exception to that seems to be the nationalism of Russia and China and places like that. The question that remains is how stable are those particular states over time? You have a wide range of opinion on that. You've got people who are both critics and sympathizers with places like Russia and China who say they're the wave of the future. You've got other people who say, no, those countries are inherently unstable and they're going to collapse under their own weight eventually, like someone like Peter Zeihan makes that kind of argument. I don't know. I'm actually agnostic on the question because I don't know enough about either country to have a fully informed opinion on it. You also see instability in other countries that are part of that axis. For example, Iran. You had a wave of protest in Iran a while back. There's a lot of ethnic and cultural fragmentation within Iran. But it does seem like the land versus sea conflict is re-emerging. One thing that the Eastern powers have in common is that they're primarily land powers. In the West, it's more the sea powers, and that's been the case ever since Athens and Sparta. And the another question is whether the regardless of what happens in the East, are those powers actually going to be able to catch up with or even supersede the dominance of the West? I think if that happens, it won't happen for a very long time. I don't see that happening anytime soon. That could be the arc of history may bend in that direction potentially, but it's not going to. I'd be very surprised if that was not the case for a very long time. Like for example, in the year 2100, what countries or parts of the world are going to be the dominant regions? That's hard to say, obviously, but is it going to be the Asian powers? We don't know, but I think that if they actually became the dominant world powers, it probably wouldn't happen until around that time. I don't really see them becoming the dominant powers by, say, mid-century or something of that type, even if they are rising. I think where we are now, again, is more like 1900, as opposed to, say, the Middle Ages when China was, a more advanced civilization than Europe. So, yeah, that's my final thought.
Okay, Florian, you get the last word.
Okay, yeah, but just what Keith just said reminded me again that maybe there will, or I mean, maybe we don't need to think in dimensions of like the United States being attacked. But since Keith brings up like in Iran and Russia, China as a sort of alliance, maybe that was North Korea in there, maybe even India in there. Then you have already plenty pushback against the projection of power from the US, right? Once Iran, wrestles control of the Strait of Hormuz away, for example, from us, then our living standards will take a notable dip. And I remember probably we all seen those little TikTok videos or Twitter videos where somebody who worked at like a 25-year-old woman, mostly those were the guys who did this. They filmed my day at Squarespace or my day at Twitter or my day at LinkedIn, and you saw her like entering. There's like a breakfast buffet. Then she heads into her yoga room and relaxes for 2 hours, and then there's a meeting for 45 minutes, and then she shows in the evening she has drinks and cocktails with friends. These kind of videos, they died down pretty quickly once the effects of the recession in 2022 were felt. So once the US feels the effects of more pushback on a global scale, and a stable pushback, not like some skirmishes, but stable pushback, then the MIC may just become a little bit less bloated, where it will become less aggressively militaristic, that remains to be seen, but the bloat will subside at least a little bit, I think.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith. Thank you, Florian. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.